Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly, and in today's video we're going to be talking about the case of Sophie Lancaster. This case was suggested to me by two of you guys, so thank you so much to Elysia and Kimberly for requesting this case through my request a case form. If you want to request a case, go to the link in the description. But honestly, I've had this case requested so many times, not just through my request a case form but also through like just comments on my videos, messages. This case has just been requested so much, so I thought it was about time that I covered it. And I'm really glad that I have decided to cover this case because I think it's a really important one, especially for young people to hear about, so you'll understand why as we go through the video. But yeah, I just want to clarify that my intent with these videos is never to offend or upset anyone that may have been involved with the case. All of the information I found on this video has been from several different sources online, so I do apologise if anything is incorrect, or if you think that I've missed something out that is really important to the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments. And having said all of that, let's just get into today's case. Sophie Lancaster was a 20-year-old girl born on the 26th of November 1986 from Lancashire in England. Growing up, I believe that Sophie was always very close with her mother Sylvia and her brother Adam, although she didn't actually live with them at the time of this case happening. She actually lived with her boyfriend Robert Maltby in Bacup, which is a small town in Lancashire. Sylvia, Sophie's mother, described Sophie as quite different from a young age. She didn't always have a huge amount of friends in school. She was always kind of an introvert from a young age. She kind of just kept herself to herself. As Sophie entered her teenage years, she developed her own kind of distinctive style. She began dressing herself and presenting herself as a goth. Sophie and her friends had a real passion for like heavy metal music, and she felt happy and comfortable expressing herself through the clothes that she wore. She really loved being a part of this gothic community. It was like a family to her. It was where she felt the most comfortable, and she had so many friends within this community who all had similar interests and all dressed in a similar way to her. Sophie would enjoy listening to music and going to gigs with this group of friends, and it was from this group of friends that she actually met Robert Maltby. Sophie and Rob hit it off pretty much straight away, and they quickly began dating, and everyone just said that they were a really well-matched couple. They had really similar interests because Rob himself was really into like heavy metal music, and he also wore quite gothic clothing. He also liked expressing himself through the clothing that he wore. Everyone who knew Sophie and Rob said that they were just meant to be together. They were like soulmates, and they really brought out the best in each other. By the time of this case happening, Sophie and Rob had been together for around 3 years, and like I said earlier, they were living together in a small flat in Bacup in Lancashire. At the time, Rob was an art student and Sophie was just about to start her degree in English, and the couple were just happy. They were happy and content, and they had everything to live for. However, that would all change for the couple on the 11th of August 2007. That day started just as any normal average day for the couple. They had spent the afternoon/evening at their friend's house in Bacup. They were having a few drinks. They weren't drunk by any means, they were just having a few drinks like you would with friends. But then at around 11:40/11:45 p.m, Sophie and Rob left their friend's house and began walking back to their flat in Bacup. They walked down a street called Market Street, and on their way back to their flat they actually stopped at a garage to purchase some cigarettes. And it was at this garage that Sophie and Rob encountered a group of young girls, and I don't believe that they knew these girls beforehand. However, these girls were really interested in Sophie and Rob's appearance, like their sense of fashion and the kind of piercings that they had. They were speaking to this group of girls for a little while, and they were all getting on really well, and so Sophie and Rob agreed to go towards the entrance of Stubby Lee Park with these girls just to kind of chat and hang out further. So like I said, they were just chatting with this group of people for a little while, and then around 1 a.m. Sophie and Rob decided to go home. However, as they began walking away, a group of 5 teenage boys just started shouting abuse at Sophie and Rob. They were just shouting insults at Sophie and Rob because of their appearance and their piercings and stuff like that. They were shouting like moshers and goths and stuff like that, mostly aimed towards Rob more than Sophie. But Sophie and Rob just continued walking. They just ignored the teenagers. But this kind of angered the teenagers. They wanted a rise out of Sophie and Rob, and they weren't getting that. And so they just decided to go up to Rob and start attacking him. The boys were literally just kicking and punching Rob everywhere, but mainly his head. And this resulted in him falling to the ground and being knocked unconscious. Whilst Rob was being attacked, Sophie was just screaming, begging these teenagers to stop, but they weren't, and there was nothing that she could really do. After severely beating Rob, the teenagers walked away and left Sophie crazy cradling his head on the ground. But the attack didn't stop there. The gang returned a few moments later and began attacking Sophie. Just like Rob, they were kicking and punching Sophie everywhere. However, they were also like jumping and stamping on her head. This attack was so vicious and brutal. After Sophie's attack, the gang just fled the scene and left Sophie and Rob unconscious, lying in a pool of their own blood on the ground. And as soon as the gang fled, a young girl who saw Sophie and Rob lying on the ground rang 999.
I can see the ambulance, please, right here. I can't see where it's going.
Paramedics rushed out straight to the scene and they found Sophie and Rob lying unconscious in the skate park area of Stubby Park. And straight away it was very obvious to paramedics that this was very serious. Sophie and Rob's faces were so bruised and swollen that initially paramedics couldn't even tell which one was male and which one was female. They were both just in very critical condition and they were rushed straight to hospital where they were both placed in intensive care. Meanwhile, it was police's priority to identify who the victims of the attack were, and they identified Robert Maltby pretty quickly because he had his ID in his pocket. However, they didn't know at this point who the other victim was. So police visited Robert Maltby's parents' house and told them about the attack, and Rob's parents told police that the female victim was probably his girlfriend, 20-year-old Sophie Lancaster. Meanwhile, the next morning, Sylvia, Sophie's mum, who lived 7 miles away from Rob and Sophie, actually got up early that morning to go into town and go to the shops and stuff like that. And when she returned home a few hours later, she opened her front door and found a police card that had been popped through the letterbox. This police card, which was obviously addressed to Sylvia, said to please call Burnley Police Station urgently. Sylvia actually left her mobile phone at home that morning, and when she went to check her phone, she saw that she had several missed calls and text messages from Sophie's older brother Adam. And so she spoke to her son Adam on the phone, and he said that he was going to come home because Sophie had been attacked and she was in intensive care in hospital. So Sylvia, who obviously had just heard this news, quickly rushed straight to the hospital to be with Sophie, who at this point was on life support, and her daughter was literally unrecognisable. Sylvia just didn't even recognise her daughter Sophie. Like I said, Sophie's face was so bruised and swollen from the horrific injuries that she had sustained. Sophie's ears were huge and full of pus. She had shoe prints on both sides of her face where she had literally been stamped on so hard by her attackers. Massive clumps of Sophie's hair had also been yanked out by her attackers, meaning that part of her scalp was missing. Rob's family were also at his bedside whilst he was in a coma, and his injuries were so horrific as well. Rob had been kicked in the head so hard that he actually sustained bleeding on the brain. Meanwhile, while Sophie and Rob were in the hospital, police began trying to piece together what happened on the night of the attack so that they could try and find out who did this to them. Police obviously visited the crime scene, the skate park where Sophie and Rob were attacked, and there were 2 pools of blood from Sophie and Rob's injuries. Around the crime scene there were also empty broken bottles and cans of alcohol, which police obviously took in to be forensically tested. So forensic teams were obviously brought in to photograph the crime scene and also collect as much forensic evidence that there might have been at the scene that could help police in trying to identify who the attackers were. So whilst all of this evidence was being gathered, police began interviewing potential witnesses, people who were thought to be at Stubby Park on the night of the attack, to see if they knew anything about the attack, to see if they maybe knew who the attackers were. Police spoke to a number of people who are thought to have been in Stubby Park around the time of the attack. However, this brought forward little information in the case because these witnesses, these potential witnesses, weren't really saying anything. It was the police's belief that maybe some of these witnesses knew the offenders, knew them personally, maybe they were friends with these attackers, and so they didn't want to rat them out or get them into trouble. Or maybe these witnesses were scared of the attackers. A lot of the time in gang-related crime, people are really hesitant to come forward to police with information because they're scared of what the gang might do to them if they grasped. Most of these potential witnesses that were being questioned by police were young people. They were teenagers because Stubby Park was a local hangout spot for young people in the area of Bacup. And so the detective investigating this case made the decision to bring in junior officers to question and talk to the young witnesses because they thought that it might be easier for the young people to open up about what they had seen on the night of the attack if they were talking to officers who were around a similar age. Whilst these questionings were taking place, news about Sophie and Rob's attack was spreading so quickly around the local area, and everyone was just in complete shock. Bacup was a small, quiet town in Lancashire. Nothing like this had ever really happened before. But as well as being shocked, people were scared, especially Sophie and Rob's friends and other people in the goth community, because they felt as though they were targets. It seemed as though Sophie and Rob were attacked literally just because of the clothes that they were wearing, because of how they were dressed, and so what's to stop the gang from attacking again? And because of this reason, police needed to find the attackers quickly because they were clearly dangerous individuals. But anyway, back to the investigation. So at this point, the junior officers were starting to make progress with the young people that they were questioning, and they began opening up a little bit more to police about what they knew regarding the assault. The witnesses slowly began providing police with the names of the 5 teenage boys who attacked Sophie and Rob, and this information quickly spread around the whole area. And so on the 11th of August, so literally the same day as the attack, 3 of these boys were arrested and taken into the police station for questioning. The other 2 boys thought to have been involved with the attack actually handed themselves in the following day. So now at this point, police had all 5 suspects in the police station and being questioned, and these boys were 17-year-old Daniel Mallet, 17-year-old Joseph Holm and 16-year-old Danny Holm, who were both brothers, and also 16-year-old Bryan Herbert and 15-year-old Brendan Harris. So initially, when these boys were being questioned, police really weren't getting much information out of them at all. They were literally just denying everything, even just being in or around Stubby Lee Park on the night of the attack. However, 2 of these boys, who I believe were the 2 brothers who handed themselves in, Danny and Joseph Holm, did admit to being in the park on the night of the attack and encountering Sophie and Rob. They also both admitted to hitting Robert Maltby once, however they said that they were not involved in the attack on Sophie Lancaster. And while some of the police officers were questioning the 5 suspects, other police officers were kind of looking into the backgrounds of these suspects, and they found that 2 of them, Bryan Herbert and Brendan Harris, actually had a history of violence. Bryan Herbert and Brendan Harris had previously been involved with another assault before the attack on Sophie and Rob. In this incident, Ryan and Brendan kicked and punched an individual to the ground. Unfortunately, on this occasion, the individual only sustained minor injuries. However, this just shows you that this wasn't the first time Ryan and Brendan had been violent. They had a history of it. Police also decided, whilst all 5 boys were in the police station and being questioned, to go to each of their houses and recover the clothing that they were wearing on the night of the attack to see if that could offer up anything in terms of forensic evidence. Visibly, it appeared as though, particularly on Bryan Herbert's clothing, that he had blood stains on his jeans and on his trainers. However, this obviously had to be forensically tested, and so his clothing and the other suspects' clothing were sent away for forensic examination. In the meantime, whilst this clothing was being tested and whilst the suspects were being questioned, police actually received a significant lead in the case from someone who had some information about the night of the attack. So if you remember earlier on in the case, I told you that before Sophie and Rob made their way to Stubby Lee Park with this group of girls, they actually stopped at a local garage and brought some cigarettes. Well, after the attack took place, a witness described seeing a young teenage boy at this same garage where Rob and Sophie purchased the cigarettes, washing what looked like blood off of his face and his hands with a hose pipe. So police, thinking that this could have been one of the boys that attacked Sophie and Rob, decided to approach the garage and ask them if they had any CCTV footage from the night of the attack. However, unfortunately they didn't. Sadly, the garage's CCTV footage system wasn't working around the time of the attack, but police still decided to investigate this potential lead because it would be stupid not to. A young teenage boy is seen washing blood off of his hands and face on the same night that Sophie and Rob were attacked. Police would be stupid if they didn't investigate that. However, when they did investigate this potential lead, they found that the person who was washing blood off his hands and face actually had nothing to do with the attack on Sophie and Rob. I don't know why this boy had blood on his hands and face. However, like I said, he had nothing to do with the attack. He had a solid alibi. He had people who could corroborate his story. And so what was a promising lead, a potential lead, was now a dead end. Despite this though, police were still confident that the boys that they had in custody were the ones that assaulted Rob and Sophie. And because of witness statements, police now had enough evidence to charge all 5 boys on the 12th of August 2007 for the assault of Robert Maltby. So it's believed, because of witness statements and also the kind of injuries that Rob sustained, that all 5 boys were involved in his attack. Each of them had kicked and punched Rob at some point. However, at this point, police didn't have sufficient evidence to be able to charge any of the boys with the attack on Sophie. Police were literally 100% certain that these boys, or at least some of these boys, were responsible for Sophie's attack. However, without any physical proof, any physical evidence of this, they obviously couldn't be charged. But they did have enough evidence to be able to charge them with Rob's attack, because there were witnesses that said they witnessed all 5 boys attack Robert Maltby. At this point, 3 of the boys, Daniel Mallet, Joseph Holm and Danny Holm, were all released on bail because they had no previous history of violence. However, the other 2 boys, Brendan Harris and Bryan Herbert, were remanded in custody at a Young Offenders Institute because, if you remember, they did have a history of violence. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Rob and Sophie were still critically ill. Rob was in a coma, like I mentioned earlier. However, he was showing signs of improvement and doctors were hopeful that he would make a full recovery. But sadly, it wasn't looking good for Sophie. She wasn't really showing any signs of improvement, and her mother Sylvia was told by doctors that if she was to pull through this, it's likely that she would probably have some brain damage. While Sophie was in hospital, detectives actually sent a forensic pathologist to go and visit her and examine her body. Now, obviously, normally pathologists examine people who are already deceased. However, in this case, the pathologist had to examine Sophie's body and her injuries while she was still alive, because a pathologist can determine how she would have sustained those injuries. So a doctor can tell you what those injuries are, but a pathologist can tell you how those injuries were sustained. And obviously the examination would have to take place fairly soon after the attack, otherwise the injuries would start to heal and it would make it a lot harder for the pathologist to determine how she got those injuries. The pathologist concluded that Sophie's head injuries were caused by repeatedly being kicked in the head by more than one person, by at least 2 people. And this was backed up by another witness who said that she saw 2 boys attacking Sophie. I believe at this point as well, the results from the forensic examination of the boys' clothing had come back, and on each of their clothes there were traces of blood. Now, this part I'm a bit confused about. There isn't too much information about this specific part online, but I don't know whose blood was on whose clothing. I believe that all 5 suspects all had traces of Robert Maltby's blood on their clothing, which obviously confirms what police already thought, that all 5 of them were involved in Robert's attack. However, I believe that only Bryan Herbert had traces of Sophie's blood on his clothing. I don't believe any of the other boys had traces of Sophie's blood on their clothing, but again, I'm not entirely sure on that, so just take that with a pinch of salt. There really isn't much information about that online that I could find anyway. But anyway, regardless, police still decided to charge all 5 boys with the assault on Sophie Lancaster as well. However, back at the hospital, Sophie was still in a really bad way. She was still deteriorating, and so 10 days after the attack on the 21st of August 2007, she was sent for a brain scan to determine if there was any brain function. And when the results of this brain scan came back, it revealed that there was no brain activity. Sophie was brain dead. And so now Sophie's family were faced with having to turn off her life support machine. On the 24th of August 2007, 13 days after the attack, Sophie Lancaster's life support machine was switched off and she passed away with her family at her side. So now that Sophie Lancaster had passed away, what was at first an assault inquiry was now a murder inquiry. And so at this point, police had to re-question all of the boys again, this time on suspicion of murder. And surprisingly, now that this was a murder inquiry, some of the boys were pretty willing to tell police exactly what happened on the night of the attack. So 15-year-old Brendan Harris claimed that he did kick and punch Robert Maltby, but not Sophie Lancaster. He said that Bryan Herbert was the one who attacked Sophie. When Bryan Herbert was questioned again, he literally just said no comment throughout the entire questioning. He was not giving anything up. However, forensic examinations of Bryan's clothing proved to police that he played a key part in her murder. I believe that Bryan had Sophie's and Rob's blood splattered up the inside of his trousers and also on his trainers, obviously indicating that he was stamping on both of them whilst both of them were bleeding. So now police had a substantial amount of evidence against Bryan Herbert. He was the main suspect in Sophie's murder, and whilst he was in custody, police were actually monitoring his phone calls. So whilst Ryan was in custody, whilst he was in this Young Offenders Institute, he actually made a phone call to his mother, and him and his mother began discussing on this phone call the attack and Sophie's murder. Now, I don't know their exact word-for-word conversation, but I believe that Ryan's mother said something to Ryan along the lines of, "Oh, don't worry, if you weren't involved in Sophie's attack, then it'll be fine." But Ryan then responded saying that he was involved in Sophie's attack and her murder. And this just confirmed what police thought all along, that Bryan Herbert was central in the attack on Sophie and Rob. However, even though they had all this evidence against Bryan Herbert, they had a huge amount of evidence at this point, he was still denying everything. He was still saying that he never attacked Sophie that night. However, police gathered even more evidence when they bugged the police van that Brendan Harris and Bryan Herbert were travelling in from the Young Offenders Institute. So like I said, police bugged the police van so that they could listen to Bryan Herbert and Brendan Harris and just see if they would discuss the attacks. And they did. When police listened back to these recordings from the police van, they heard both boys discussing Sophie's murder, and they also heard Bryan Herbert describing how he kicked Sophie's head like a football. Even though Ryan was clearly central to the attacks, police still wanted to charge all 5 boys with murder by joint enterprise. And so that's exactly what they did on the 6th of September 2007. All 5 boys were also charged with grievous bodily harm with intent for the attack on Robert Maltby. By early November, Robert Maltby had recovered enough to be able to leave hospital. His physical scars were healing, however, as you can imagine, his mental and emotional scars still remain. Fortunately, he was well enough to attend his girlfriend's funeral, Sophie's funeral, on the 12th of November 2007. Meanwhile, the trial for Sophie's murder was set for March of 2008. However, before the trial had even began, Bryan Herbert's legal team were actually trying to get his charge reduced from murder to manslaughter on the basis that he had diminished responsibility because he was autistic. And so detectives in Sophie's case brought in an expert in autism to give Bryan Herbert an assessment to see if he in fact was autistic. However, he wasn't. The assessment results revealed that Ryan was not autistic, and it seemed as though this was just a desperate attempt by Ryan's legal team so that he would serve less time for Sophie's murder. They obviously knew that there was no way he was going to be found not guilty with all of the evidence, and so it seemed as though, like I said, this was just a kind of desperate attempt to try and get him less time. The trial began on the 10th of March 2008 at Preston Crown Court, and all 5 boys pled guilty to the charge of grievous bodily harm with intent against Robert Maltby, and they were all also facing the charge of the murder of Sophie Lancaster. However, on the first day of the trial, Bryan Herbert, who so far had always protested his innocence and said that he never attacked Sophie, suddenly pled guilty to her murder. Police obviously knew that he killed her all along with all the evidence against him. However, he himself never actually said, "I killed Sophie Lancaster," until this point. So now at this point, because Bryan Herbert had pled guilty to Sophie's murder and finally admitted that he was involved in her attack, police decided to withdraw the charge of murder against 3 of the boys, Danny and Joseph Holm and Daniel Mallet. Police believed that Daniel Mallet and Danny and Joseph Holm didn't actually have anything to do with Sophie's attack. They were only involved with Rob's attack. However, they didn't have any solid evidence to prove this until Bryan Herbert admitted guilt, until he pled guilty. And so the charges of murder were then dropped against those 3, like I said, when Bryan Herbert pled guilty. Police said that Ryan's guilty plea almost kind of diluted the evidence against the other 3 boys who were just involved in Rob's attack. However, the other boy, the 4th boy, Brendan Harris, was still being charged with Sophie's murder because police believed that he was involved in Sophie's attack. And I'll get into why police believe that Brendan Harris was also involved in Sophie's attack in a second, but Brendan Harris pled guilty to the GBH on Robert Maltby, but not guilty to Sophie Lancaster's murder. He was saying that he had nothing to do with Sophie's attack and that was all Bryan Herbert. And so now the prosecution had to prove that Brendan Harris alongside Bryan Herbert were the two responsible for the attack on Sophie Lancaster. So the prosecution presented the jury with what they believe happened on the night of the attack, what the kind of timeline of events were. So they said that Robert and Sophie, after having spent some time at their friend's house, made their way back home at around 11:40 p.m. on the 10th of August 2007. As they walked home, they stopped by a local garage where they purchased some cigarettes, and they got chatting to that group of young girls who, like I said before, were really interested in Sophie and Rob's appearance and their piercings and stuff like that. And then with this group of girls, Sophie and Rob walked to Stubby Park. I'm sorry, I know that you guys already know this information. I'm just kind of running through it again because this is what the prosecution presented to the jury. After this, the group with Sophie and Rob walked to the skate park area, and at this point the five boys, the five offenders, were already in the park. Two of the boys had been drinking in the park that night, although I'm not actually sure which two, but I'm guessing it was probably Ryan and Brendan, but I don't know. And some of the boys had also been involved with some sex with some girls in the park that night as well. Whilst Rob and Sophie were getting along really well with this group of girls, the group of five teenage boys, the five offenders, began discussing how they were going to batter Robert Maltby because of how he looked. According to sources that I read online, Brendan Harris was the one to first punch Robert Maltby. He threw the first punch, essentially starting the attack, and then the other five boys began punching and kicking him as well until he was led unconscious on the floor. By this point, when Rob was unconscious, all five boys had fled the scene, and Sophie, having just witnessed her boyfriend being severely beaten, knelt down beside him and began cradling his head. And then the prosecution believed that Bryan Herbert and Brendan Harris decided to turn around and start attacking Sophie as well. They were kicking her, punching her, just beating her around the head. Honestly, this is one of the most brutal attacks I have ever looked into. And although Bryan Herbert had admitted to Sophie's murder, had admitted to being involved in Sophie's attack, Brendan Harris still wasn't. He was still denying any involvement in Sophie's murder, and his defense team were just arguing that Sophie's attack was all down to Bryan Herbert. It was all Bryan Herbert. Brendan's defense team also argued that there was no forensic evidence linking him to Sophie's murder, which was true. There was nothing forensically linking him to the crime. There was no blood evidence, I don't believe, linking him to the crime or anything like that. However, the prosecution presented the jury with other evidence against Brendan Harris. This evidence against Brendan was firstly testimony from a witness who said that she saw two boys attacking Sophie, not just Bryan Herbert but also Brendan Harris, and also the evidence from the pathologist who viewed Sophie's body in hospital. This pathologist confirmed that two people had been involved in Sophie's attack, and obviously Brendan Harris and Bryan Herbert were the only two seen by witnesses. But also Brendan actually took to the stand and gave evidence in his trial, and he wasn't very convincing at all. The jury could just tell that he was lying. And so with all of this evidence against Brendan Harris, he was obviously found guilty of the murder of Sophie Lancaster on the 27th of March 2008. Sentencing for this case was a month later, and so on the 28th of April 2007, both Brendan Harris and Bryan Herbert were sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending that Brendan should serve at least 18 years and Bryan 16 years and 3 months. The three other defendants, Danny Holm, Joseph Holm and Daniel Mallet, all obviously pled guilty to GBH for the attack on Robert Maltby. Daniel Mallet was sentenced to 4 years and 4 months in prison, and the Holm brothers, Danny and Joseph, were sentenced to 5 years and 10 months each. And in June of 2008, so not even 2 months into their sentences, it was reported that all 5 boys were actually trying to appeal against their sentences because they all felt as though their sentences were too harsh. And in October of that same year, the results from the appeals came in. Bryan Herbert was the only one of the 5 defendants whose appeal was actually successful, and his sentence was reduced from 16 years and 3 months to 15 years and 6 months, so he had 9 months taken off of his sentence. Bryan's legal team argued that his sentence was too harsh considering the fact that he actually pled guilty to Sophie's murder. However, Brendan Harris and the 3 other defendants have failed to obtain any reduction in their sentences. So before I end this video, I just want to tell you about some of the amazing work that Sophie's mother Sylvia has done to try and bring something positive from her daughter's death. So when Sophie died, Sylvia Lancaster didn't want her death to be in vain, and she wanted to keep her daughter's memory alive. And so she set up a charity in her daughter's name, and this charity is known as the Sophie Lancaster Foundation. It's also known as the SOPHIE charity, which stands for Stamp Out Prejudice, Hatred and Intolerance Everywhere. The charity holds fundraising activities and events and campaigns, and one of their main aims is to educate people, young people especially, on hate crime and how people from different subcultures such as the Gothic culture should just be treated the same as everyone else. Just because someone chooses to dress or present themselves in a certain way does not mean that they don't deserve the same respect that others are shown. I just think that the work that Sylvia Lancaster has done in Sophie's name is incredible, and that the things that they stand for are so important. So I highly recommend that you go and check out the website. You can also actually buy merchandise from the Sophie Lancaster Foundation. I'm actually wearing some of the merchandise right now. I ordered this little Sophie wristband last week. It just says Sophie on it. It's just a black wristband and I really like it. I also wanted to buy a little pin that said Sophie on, but they were actually out of stock when I went on the website, so as soon as that's back in stock I will be ordering that. And the proceeds from the website obviously go to the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, which, like I've said before, is such a worthy cause. But the merch store honestly has such a wide range of products. There's like t-shirts, bottle openers, pens, really cool stuff. So I'll leave the link in the description of this video if you want to check it out. Also, just a little bit of information about Robert Maltby, Sophie's boyfriend, who obviously was also attacked that night. He did an interview with BBC Three in 2017, so 10 years after the attack, about his life and how he suffered mentally after the attack. So again, I'll leave that linked in the description as well in case you want to go and watch that. He understandably still suffers mentally because of the attack, and he does worry that he's going to bump into the 3 boys who also attacked him that night. Obviously, the only 2 boys still serving time are Bryan Herbert and Brendan Harris. However, the other 3 boys are released. They're free now, and so he does worry that he might bump into them one day. But from what I can gather online, Robert is doing really well for himself. He has completed his illustration degree because he was really into art and stuff, and I just hope that he is doing okay, because he honestly deserves the best life after what he's been through. In 2017, so 10 years after the attack, BBC Three actually made a drama about this case, which is called Murdered for Being Different. The drama is about an hour long and I haven't actually seen it yet. However, it's on BBC Three's website, so I do intend to watch it at some point. But yeah, that is pretty much it for this case. A really sad case. It's one of those cases that make me so angry. Sophie and Rob were literally attacked just because of how they look, just because of how they chose to dress themselves, and it makes me so angry, because that is just absolutely disgusting. They literally hadn't done anything wrong. They'd never met these 5 boys before, and these boys just decided to attack them just because of how they looked, and it honestly infuriates me. I know I've already said this already, but if you can, please do check out the Sophie Lancaster Foundation website, and if you can donate, I will be donating. I just think it's such a worthy cause, such a good charity. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. Thank you again to Kimberly and Elysia for requesting this case. A special shout out to the members of my Patreon. Thank you so much for your support, guys. If anyone else is interested in becoming a Patreon member, I will leave the link in the description of this video. Thank you so much for watching. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys.